A black woman just returned from a long and exhausting flight, ready to finally relax, but when she steps into the airport, everything changes. A flight attendant targets her without cause, humiliates her in front of everyone, and forces her to move from her seat in first class despite having a valid ticket. But what happens next shocks everyone and sets off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you find this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It all began just like any other travel day. The woman, just trying to get home, thought it would be a peaceful, uneventful flight. But when she was asked to move, she had no idea that the simple act would spiral into something much bigger, shaking the foundation of what we believe about equality, respect, and fairness. The Asheville Regional Airport, nestled quietly in the rolling hills of North Carolina, hums with the anticipation of the holiday season. The terminal, though small, is filled with the soft glow of twinkling lights, a silent witness to the reunions and farewells of families and strangers alike. Saw Rivers, clutching her boarding pass in her hand, steps into this festive space, but it all feels like a distant painting, something she can admire but not quite step into. For her, the warmth of the season is overshadowed by the weight of something far heavier than the duffel bag slung across her shoulder. Saw is a young woman, only 20, but life has already handed her a burden far beyond her years. A year of sickness, medical treatments, and long, painful recoveries has left her feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The body she once knew, lean and strong, now feels foreign to her, more a prison than a vessel of her spirit. She avoids mirrors, dreading the reflection that greets her, the full figure, the curves she never asked for, a reminder of her fragility. Today, her father, James, has insisted that she take the first-class ticket he gifted her, a gesture of love, a way to provide her comfort after such a grueling recovery. "You deserve this, Saw," he told her, the words warm and filled with the kind of care only a parent could give. But even as she boards the flight, the familiar whispers of self-doubt invade her mind. Will they look at me differently? She wonders. Will I belong here? As the flight announcement calls for first-class passengers, Saw hesitates for just a moment before she steps forward, gripping her ticket tightly. The gate agent scans it with practiced ease, not even offering her a second glance. But as she walks toward the jet bridge, the stares from the other passengers begin to land on her back. There is a pressure, a subtle discomfort, as if her presence in first class is an error, something that doesn't quite fit the picture. Inside the cabin, the luxury of first class is starkly in contrast to the discomfort she feels. The plush leather seats, the ample legroom, the soft scent of citrus cleaner in the air, all of it should have been soothing. Yet, as she settles into her seat, there's a gnawing unease that keeps her rooted in the present moment. She feels the weight of every whisper, every glance, and every moment of judgment that she can't escape. The silent, invisible pressure that many Black Americans feel on a daily basis, the quiet acknowledgement that you don't belong in spaces where others assume you should not be. The stares grow more pronounced. A couple seated across the aisle exchanges glances, their eyes darting toward her, then quickly looking away. A man, 2 rows ahead, peers over his newspaper with an unreadable expression, but his gaze lingers too long. The subtle discomfort of their gazes lands on her, a painful reminder of the unwelcome truth. In their eyes, she doesn't belong here. And then, the flight attendant arrives, Kayla Monroe, a young woman with blonde hair neatly pinned back, her uniform crisp and immaculate. Her smile is polite, but it doesn't reach her eyes. She stands before Saw, a perfect embodiment of the system that so often undermines Black lives in ways both overt and quiet. "I'm sorry, but this seat isn't available for you," Kayla says, her words laced with the coldness of something more insidious than mere protocol. Confusion wraps itself around Saw. "But this is my seat," she stammers, holding out her ticket, trying to use the one thing she believes can protect her, her proof, her entitlement. Kayla's face hardens for just a moment, then softens back into a mask of politeness. "Right, of course," she says, her tone flat. "But we may need to move you to another seat." "I'll check." And with that, Saw is thrust into a new kind of battle. Not just a battle for a seat, but for the very right to exist in a space that others have decided is not meant for her. The whispers around her grow louder as the eyes of the passengers turn into a chorus of judgment and dismissal. In that moment, Saw does what so many do in these situations. She remains silent. She looks around the cabin, desperately hoping for someone, anyone, to speak up in her defense. But the truth is, they won't. The subtle racism embedded in everyday life, often unnoticed by those who do not live it, is present in these moments. It is the silent complicity of those who choose to stay silent. It is the tension in the air that she has learned to breathe, and yet, she cannot escape. And when Kayla returns with a polite but pointed apology, Saw feels it, the cold sting of exclusion, the silent message that her body, her presence, is not enough to warrant the same respect and dignity granted to others. This is the quiet cruelty of racism in America, the way it creeps into every corner of life, the way it lingers in spaces we are told belong to us but are not designed for us. Saw does not know it yet, but this moment will stay with her, a constant shadow in her journey toward reclaiming her own dignity. As the plane takes off, Saw stares out the window, the runway stretching into the distance, the dark sky above reflecting the weight of her internal struggle. She clutches the armrest, her breath shallow. The flight is long, but the path ahead is longer still. What she doesn't realize, what no one can see at this moment, is that this journey is only just beginning, and the real fight lies ahead, not for a seat, but for the right to occupy the spaces that are always meant for her. In that moment, she is not just fighting for comfort. She is fighting for her own recognition, her worth, her place in this world. A battle that millions like her are waging every single day. And the cost of this fight? It is far higher than any seat on an airplane. The engines hummed softly as the plane began its ascent, lifting Saw away from the familiar landscape of Asheville and into the expanse of the sky. She tried to settle into the plush leather seat, the soft glow of the overhead lights flickering like distant stars, but the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her chest. This was supposed to be a reprieve, a chance to recover, to heal. But instead, she found herself tangled in an invisible battle that no one had warned her she would face. The moment her feet had touched the terminal, she had entered a war that had nothing to do with her body or her health, but everything to do with how others saw her. Saw closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, willing herself to breathe through the tension. But the memories from earlier, Kayla's cold smile, the whispers, the way the air seemed to thicken around her, swirled in her mind. The subtle judgments, the small slights, they had all come crashing together in a way she couldn't escape. This was not just about a seat on a plane. This was about something deeper, something insidious, the quiet fire of racism that burned in every glance, every whisper, every movement of the crowd that said, without words, "You do not belong here." The plane climbed higher, and Saw shifted in her seat, trying to focus on the view outside the window. But the view did nothing to calm her. It was just a blur, the world beneath her disappearing as if the problems she carried might also vanish with distance. But she knew better. Racism did not disappear just because you moved away from it. It had been woven into the fabric of this country long before she was born, a thread running through every corner of life. It wasn't a loud, violent roar. It was the quiet hum in the background, the thing that told you that your very presence, your body, your being, was an inconvenience to the world around you. And then, just as she thought she might breathe easy, Kayla appeared again. This time, her expression was colder, her smile even more forced. "I'm sorry, but we need to make some adjustments," she said, her voice laced with an authority that made Saw's stomach twist. She leaned in closer, as if the seat itself had become a matter of personal grievance. "We'll need to move you, Miss Rivers." Saw's heart sank. She had anticipated this in a way. But nothing could have prepared her for the sting of Kayla's words, her demeanor. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was deliberate. The way Kayla spoke to her, the words she chose, told Saw everything she needed to know. There was no mistake. There was no oversight. She was being pushed aside, not because there was any legitimate reason to do so, but because, in Kayla's eyes, she did not belong. Saw gripped the armrest harder, her knuckles turning white. How long would it take before people stopped telling her she wasn't worthy? She thought of her father, of the way he'd looked at her when he handed her the ticket. He had been proud of her, proud of how far she had come, how hard she had fought to reclaim her life. But now, sitting in this sterile cabin with nothing but cold eyes around her, she felt the weight of an entire system pushing against her. Kayla, with her perfectly pressed uniform and crisp voice, tried to be polite, but her every word cut deeper. "This is just a procedure," she said, though the words felt hollow. They were meant to dismiss, to shut down any argument, any questioning. It wasn't the procedure that was the problem, it was the people enforcing it. The people who saw someone like Saw and made her feel smaller, less worthy, simply because of her body, her skin. As Saw rose from her seat, she felt the weight of every stare upon her. This isn't just about a seat on an airplane, she thought. This is about the spaces they say I do not deserve to occupy. It was subtle, the way it worked. They didn't need to yell at her, to overtly discriminate. They did it with a glance, with a quiet refusal to acknowledge her humanity. The walk down the aisle to the back of the plane felt like an eternity. Each step felt heavy, each gaze from the other passengers like an accusation. She clutched her bag tighter, as if the fabric could shield her from the weight of the world's judgment. The small whispers, the murmurs of discontent, it all drowned her in a sea of self-doubt and shame. And yet, no one spoke up. No one stood between her and the pain she felt. They simply watched, silently complicit in her humiliation. When she finally reached the narrow seat in the back of the plane, her body sagged with the weight of it all. She tried to settle into the cramped space, but it wasn't enough. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being erased from a place where she belonged, where she had every right to be. The plane's engines hummed, and Saw could feel the tension in her chest tightening with every mile. They won't stop. This wasn't just about a seat, it was a message. A message that she was always going to be too much, too loud, too visible in spaces they thought were for people like them. The message was clear: you do not belong. But even as she sat in the back, the smallest flicker of defiance began to burn within her. She would not let them take this from her. She would not let them strip her of her worth. This moment, this injustice, would fuel the fire that would drive her to stand tall, to take back what was rightfully hers. As the plane soared higher, Saw gazed out the window again, watching the world grow smaller beneath her. She realized something: they might try to erase me, but they cannot make me disappear. And with that realization, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Saw's eyes flicked open as the plane cruised steadily through the sky. The hum of the engines became a background noise, as constant and unyielding as the racial tensions that had shaped her life. She had hoped that once she was in the air, the distance between her and the problems below would lessen. But the truth was, those problems, the ones that weighed on her, had no geography. They were the ghosts that followed her, stalking her every step, every breath, even in the false comfort of a first-class seat. It wasn't just the sting of Kayla's earlier words, the cold dismissal. It was the silent way the other passengers had reacted, the unspoken agreement that her presence here, her existence in this space, was somehow wrong. The subtle rejection. The subtle, everyday racism that people like her had learned to endure without a sound. No, it wasn't the overt acts of violence or the loud, hate-filled words that hurt the most. It was the quiet whispers. The sideways glances. The casual way people like Kayla dismissed her humanity. That was the sharpest pain. As the plane soared, Saw felt the discomfort in her chest tighten again. The thoughts wouldn't leave her alone. Why had she been singled out? Was it because of her body? The weight she had struggled with over the past year, a consequence of illness and treatments that had taken everything from her but her will to survive? Or was it because she was Black, and in the eyes of many, that meant she was never supposed to occupy these spaces, spaces of luxury, spaces of power, spaces of worth? A voice interrupted her thoughts. A man, sitting 2 rows ahead, turned in his seat, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. He had been silent until now, but as soon as Saw felt his gaze, it was different. This time, it wasn't a look of judgment, of silence, of complicity. He spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying across the aisle. "Why is she being asked to move? She has a ticket for that seat." Saw's heart skipped a beat. She didn't expect this. For a moment, she thought it was a dream, a fleeting moment of solidarity in the sea of indifference. Kayla, who had been walking briskly down the aisle, paused. The polite smile she had been wearing seemed to falter just a bit, but she quickly recovered, flashing it back into place. "We appreciate your concern, sir, but we are simply following procedures." "Procedures," the man repeated, his voice rising just slightly, a note of incredulity in it. "Is this procedure? Or is it something else? She has the right to stay in her seat." But there was no answer from Kayla, just the cold professionalism that had become her shield. She turned and walked toward the front of the cabin without acknowledging the man further. The awkward silence that followed felt like a judgment of its own. Saw sat frozen in her seat. She wanted to speak up, to tell the man that it didn't matter what seat she was moved to. This was about something far deeper than a seat on a plane. It was about the space that people like her were allowed to occupy in this world, a world that had never quite been ready to accept her as equal. A world that still whispered every day, "Not you. Not here." And yet, no one had spoken. The others watched, like silent spectators in the theater of her humiliation. The murmurs that followed her down the aisle when she was moved to economy, those quiet voices behind her, told her all she needed to know. The system had already made its judgment. She did not belong in first class. When she finally sat down in the cramped seat in the back, Saw felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She was still trying to make sense of the small moments, the ones that didn't make the headlines. This was not the kind of racism that could be seen or quantified. It wasn't the kind of racism that came with angry words and raised fists. It was quiet. It was subtle. And yet, it hurt in ways that nothing else could. As the flight continued, she found herself reflecting on her life, on the long history of Black Americans who had endured similar moments of quiet rejection. Her father had taught her that racism wasn't always loud. It didn't always come with explicit insults or violent acts. Sometimes, it was just in the way people looked at you. In the way they didn't look at you. In the way they assumed you didn't belong, no matter what your accomplishments, no matter what you had earned. She thought of her father, James, and how he had worked hard his entire life to provide for her, to give her opportunities he never had. His love had been constant, unwavering, even in the face of a world that seemed determined to erase his value. But now, Saw realized that even with all of his hard work, even with all the sacrifices, there were still invisible barriers, barriers that said, "You do not belong." The flight finally began its descent into Chicago. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin, and Saw snapped back into the present moment. But the heaviness in her chest did not lift. It wasn't just the flight. It was everything that had led up to this, every small moment where her presence had been questioned, where her value had been diminished. She could feel it all piling up, stacking higher with each passing minute. When the plane finally touched down, Saw wasn't sure if she felt relief or dread. She gathered her belongings mechanically, barely registering the movement of passengers rushing to the door. All she could think about was how the world outside had been waiting for her, waiting to put her in her place, to tell her once again that she wasn't enough. As she stepped off the plane, the weight of it all pressed against her like a second skin. She wanted to escape it, to leave it behind, but she knew better now. This fight, the one she had inherited, the one she would never be able to outrun, was hers to carry. Saw stepped off the plane, her feet heavy as they hit the terminal floor. The cool, indifferent air of Chicago surrounded her, but it didn't feel like a reprieve. Instead, it was like a continuation of the journey she had already begun, a journey she never asked for. The weight of what had happened, what was still happening, pressed on her chest, invisible but undeniable. She had hoped the physical distance between Asheville and Chicago would give her some relief, but the truth was, it was a short escape from a long battle. And the battle had changed. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. It was about the world's perception of her. About how she, a Black woman, was expected to fit into spaces she was told weren't meant for her, spaces that others had deemed exclusive. It was a battle for her very existence in those spaces, a battle for the right to be seen as equal. But that right was constantly questioned, constantly denied, by an invisible force that no one dared name. At the baggage claim, Saw tried to shake off the heaviness that had settled in her bones. She glanced around at the sea of people, their faces a blur of indifference, their movements efficient and calculated. The hum of the airport, the murmurs of travelers, filled the air, but Saw's thoughts were consumed by something much deeper than the noise around her. As she waited for her luggage, she saw Ryan, a thin man in a neon vest, standing by the conveyor belt. His name tag read Ryan, and his eyes immediately locked onto hers, as if to measure her, to see if she was worthy of the attention she was about to receive. He was, after all, just doing his job, wasn't he? Just following orders. But in the space between them, 1,000 unspoken judgments passed through the air, invisible but palpable. She could feel them. Looking for this? Ryan asked with a smirk, holding up a suitcase that wasn't hers. He dropped it onto the floor with an exaggerated thud, letting it hit the ground hard, as if to make a point. His actions spoke louder than any words could. This was not a mistake. This was not carelessness. This was deliberate. Saw took a breath, feeling the heat of humiliation rush to her cheeks. It wasn't just that he had mishandled her luggage. It was the way he treated her, the dismissive, casual cruelty with which he handed her bag back. There was something in the way he looked at her, something in the air between them that spoke of a deep-seated belief, you don't belong here, and I'll make sure you remember it. She took the bag from him, her fingers trembling slightly as she grasped the handle. She wanted to say something, to confront him, to ask why he felt entitled to treat her this way. But her voice, like so many times before, was swallowed by the weight of the invisible rules that governed their interactions. Who would listen? Who would care? The silent oppression that had followed her from the moment she boarded the plane didn't end with the flight. It lingered, a shadow cast over every interaction, every glance, every exchange. It wasn't the loud, overt kind of hatred that you could point to, the kind that shouted from the rooftops. No, this was the kind of racism that lived in the spaces between words, in the way people looked at you when they thought you weren't looking, in the way their hands tightened just a little too much when they handed something over to you. It was the invisible force that dictated who got to sit in first class, who got to travel with dignity, who got to be seen as worthy. As Saw walked away from the baggage claim area, she felt the weight of it all pressing in on her, suffocating her. She had told herself that the further she traveled, the further she distanced herself from the pain, the easier it would become. But instead, the pain was always with her. It didn't matter how many miles she put between herself and Asheville, between herself and the moments of humiliation. It followed her like a shadow, a constant reminder that no matter how much she had accomplished, no matter how hard she worked, the world still saw her as less. And that thought, that quiet, insidious thought, began to seep deeper into her consciousness. I am less. It wasn't an outright declaration, but it was the message she had been receiving her whole life. The message whispered quietly in the back of her mind, the one that told her that her skin, her body, her very presence in spaces of power and privilege was a mistake. She felt it most acutely now, as she walked through the terminal, the eyes of strangers on her as they passed by, the unspoken judgments hanging in the air, like smoke from a fire that could not be seen but could certainly be felt. It was the weight of silence, of complicity, of an entire system designed to remind people like her that they were never supposed to occupy the spaces where the world's power was held. And it was a weight that Saw had learned to carry for most of her life, quietly, silently, without protest. But as she moved through the crowd, she realized something. She was tired. Tired of the silence. tired of the way the world, and so many people in it, had learned to look the other way when faced with injustice. Tired of being the one who was expected to endure the pain and humiliation of a system that never seemed to change. As she reached the exit, her mind raced with the knowledge that she could no longer accept this. She could no longer let this invisible force dictate who she was, how she moved through the world, how she belonged. But for now, the challenge remained the same. How could she begin to push back against the system that had spent her entire life trying to keep her down? How could she change the rules that had been written before she was born? The weight of the silence still pressed on her, but for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a promise of victory. But it was a start, a small flicker of resistance, a quiet defiance that burned brighter than she had ever allowed herself to feel before. And that, Saw realized, was the beginning of something much larger than herself. The taxi ride from the airport to her father's house was a quiet one. Saw had expected it to be a time of respite, a moment to pull herself together before facing her family. But the silence in the car was thick, suffocating. Her mind churned with the weight of everything that had happened. She had hoped that, after the flight, after the baggage claim, the pain would subside, that she would find solace in the familiar. But instead, she felt more isolated than ever. Her father's house, small, humble, and filled with the scent of pine and coffee, had always been a place of refuge. But today, it felt like a fortress, one she wasn't sure she could enter. It wasn't that her father's love was in question, it was that she knew the world outside had shaped him in ways she had only begun to understand. His quiet resilience, his strength in the face of the system that worked to break him, had always been a pillar in her life. But now, as she stepped through the door, the burden of her experience felt too heavy to lay at his feet. James was in the kitchen, humming along to a Christmas song. The warmth of the scene contrasted sharply with the cold tension Saw felt inside. As she entered, he smiled warmly, turning to face her with that familiar, open expression. But even as he reached for her, a shadow of concern flickered across his face. Saw didn't need words to understand it. He could feel it, he could always feel it. "Something happened," he said softly, his voice tinged with a quiet certainty that spoke of years of knowing his daughter better than she knew herself. "Talk to me, Saw." The words stuck in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything about the way Kayla had looked at her, the way the other passengers had whispered behind her back. But she couldn't. She couldn't even look him in the eye, afraid that his pain would mix with hers, creating something they could not bear. The truth was, she wasn't sure how to explain it all. How do you explain the constant weight of being Black in America, the small cuts and bruises that accumulate over a lifetime, the subtle ways the world tells you that you're not enough? Instead, she forced a smile and shook her head. "It was fine, Dad. I'm just tired." James didn't press further. But Saw could feel his gaze on her as he moved around the kitchen, preparing their meal. The tension in the room was thick, but for now, they allowed the silence to be their shield. Later that evening, as she went upstairs to her room, Saw's thoughts became a storm she couldn't outrun. She had always known her place in the world was precarious, at times invisible, at times too visible. She had learned, over the years, to fight back the subtle jabs, to hold her ground when the world told her she didn't belong. But after today, after everything that had happened on the flight, she was no longer sure of her own strength. It wasn't just that she had been moved to a seat in economy, that she had been made to feel small in a space meant to elevate her. It was the look on Kayla's face, the way she had dismissed her, the quiet cruelty of the words that were never spoken aloud. It was the way every action on the plane had been part of a much larger pattern, a pattern of exclusion, of erasure, of people like Saw being constantly told that they didn't belong in spaces of privilege. That night, after dinner, Saw stood by her window, staring out at the backyard. The cold night air pressed against the glass, and she felt a coldness inside her, too. The weight of the world's judgment had never been more apparent. But as she gazed at the snow-covered backyard, her eyes fell on the old wooden bridge that spanned the creek behind their house. It was a bridge she had crossed countless times as a child, her imagination running wild with every step. The bridge had always been a symbol of transition, of passage from one place to another, from childhood to adulthood, from innocence to experience. Tonight, the bridge felt different. It wasn't a symbol of possibility anymore, it was a reminder. A reminder that she was still caught between two worlds, one where she was told she was not enough, and one where she was learning, slowly but surely, to claim her space in the world. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "Sa," he called gently from downstairs. "Dinner's ready." For a moment, Sa didn't answer. She stood by the window, her eyes tracing the outline of the bridge. Her father's quiet concern had never felt more suffocating. She was tired of carrying the weight of what had happened, but more than that, she was tired of carrying the weight of all the times this had happened before, the times when her presence had been questioned, the times when her value had been diminished. As she descended the stairs, she knew what was coming. She knew her father would ask her again what had happened, would press for answers, even if he didn't say it aloud. But she couldn't tell him everything, not yet. Dinner was quiet, and for a moment, Sa allowed herself to slip into the rhythm of the meal. The clink of silverware, the soft hum of the old refrigerator, the smell of roasted chicken, it all grounded her, pulling her back from the storm that raged inside her. But the storm was still there, waiting. The thoughts returned again. Was I wrong to feel this way? Was I wrong to be angry? When she excused herself from the table and returned to her room, her father's concern followed her. She knew he wanted to protect her, but she didn't know how to explain that she wasn't just hurting from what had happened today. She was hurting because the world had taught her to expect this. This was not an isolated event. It was a part of a system that had been built on her exclusion. It wasn't just Kayla and Ryan. It was the thousands of invisible hands that upheld the status quo, the small acts of violence that added up over time. She sank into her chair by the window, her mind spinning. The bridge outside looked fragile, almost abandoned. She could cross it again, but something held her back. Fear. Doubt. What would she find on the other side? A world that would finally accept her? Or a world that would reject her all over again? As the night wore on, Sa made a decision. She wouldn't just stand in the shadows anymore, letting the world tell her she didn't belong. She couldn't. The invisible weight of racism, of exclusion, had worn her down enough. It was time to step out of the shadows, to confront the world with the anger, the pain, and the strength that had always lived within her. The next morning, Sa knew she couldn't stay silent. But the question lingered. How? How do you fight against an invisible enemy? How do you make the world see you for what you are, not less than, but equal to everyone else? She didn't have the answers yet, but she was determined to find them. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step in reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and her place in this world. She looked at the bridge again. This time, it didn't seem so far away. It's time, she thought. It's time to cross it. The days that followed felt like a slow march through mud. Sa had always been a resilient young woman, but now, even the small tasks seemed monumental. She had returned to her daily routine, but the shadow of what had happened during her flight clung to her like an unwanted cloak. She couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched, constantly judged, not just for her appearance, but for her very existence. She had hoped that returning home would provide some reprieve, a chance to heal. But instead, the reality of the world outside had seeped deeper into her bones, harder to ignore than ever. Each time she stepped outside, each time she entered a store, or even walked down the street, the feeling of eyes on her lingered. People didn't say it out loud, but Sa could feel it, the way some people looked past her as if she wasn't even there, or worse, the way others looked at her as if she didn't belong. It wasn't just the overt stares or the racist comments. No, it was something more insidious. It was the way people found subtle ways to exclude her, to remind her, in ways that could be dismissed as unintentional or unspoken, that she was never fully allowed to be herself in certain spaces. These were the quiet forms of oppression that permeated every aspect of life, the quiet rejection, the unspoken rules that told her she was always on the outside looking in. Saw had spent years trying to navigate these spaces, trying to make herself small enough, quiet enough, to fit into a world that constantly told her that she did not belong. But now, after the incident on the plane, after the countless moments where she had been made to feel invisible, she knew that silence wasn't going to be enough anymore. She couldn't shrink herself into the background any longer. But where to begin? The truth was, Saw felt like she was always walking on a tightrope, balancing between her own dignity and the world's refusal to see her for what she truly was. She thought of her father's quiet strength, his ability to carry the weight of this world without ever complaining, without ever allowing the indignities to break him. But the truth was, he carried a burden too. He had lived a lifetime of fighting for his place in this world, and in some ways, he had been forced to accept the injustices that came his way. He had taught her to fight, but now Saw felt a growing awareness of just how heavy the cost of that fight truly was. Her father had always carried the weight of the world with him, but his silence, his unwillingness to speak out against the quiet injustices that surrounded them, had been a shield. A way to protect her from the unbearable pain of knowing how much the world was stacked against them. But Saw couldn't pretend anymore. The weight of this invisible prejudice was too heavy. She couldn't turn a blind eye to it any longer. And yet, the world seemed to be pushing back harder than ever. Every moment of silence, every moment of restraint, was now a reminder of just how little had changed in the decades that her father had lived through. How many Black men and women had lived and died under the same unspoken rules that defined who could belong and who could not? How many times had they been silenced, dismissed, erased from the spaces that were supposed to be for everyone? As she sat at her father's kitchen table, staring at the half-empty mug of coffee in front of her, Saw realized the full scope of the battle ahead. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She was fighting against the quiet systems of oppression that worked tirelessly to exclude people like her from spaces of power, privilege, and respect. The next morning, she went to her father. He was in the living room, reading the paper. She hesitated for a moment, wondering how to bring it up, how to speak of the things she had been feeling. But she couldn't wait any longer. "Dad," she began, her voice steady but tinged with the uncertainty she felt. "I need to talk to you about something." James looked up, his expression softening immediately. He set the paper down and motioned for her to sit. "What's on your mind, Saw?" Saw took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment, the first step in confronting the quiet injustices that had shaped her life. "Dad, I don't think I can stay silent anymore. I can't just ignore what happened on that flight. I can't pretend that everything's fine, that I'm fine. I'm not fine." James' face softened, his eyes filled with both concern and a deep understanding. He had always known the weight of the world bore down on his daughter, just as it had on him, but hearing her say it out loud was something different. It was a turning point. He had spent his life navigating the world in silence, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to make the world listen. But now, Saw was speaking out, demanding that the world see her for what she was. A human being, equal to everyone else. "I know, Saw," he said quietly, his voice full of a weariness that spoke of a lifetime of fighting for space, for dignity, and for recognition. "I know it's not easy. But you have to understand that speaking out, speaking your truth, comes at a cost. The world doesn't like to hear it. They don't want to be reminded of how deep this runs. But we have to remind them," Saw said, her voice growing stronger. "We can't just let this be. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. What happened to me, to us, it's not an accident. It's not a mistake. It's the system working exactly the way it's supposed to work." James stared at her, his eyes filled with both pride and sadness. "I've fought this battle for so long, Saw," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you're right. The silence, the pretending, it doesn't do anything but keep us in our place." Saw could see the pain in her father's eyes, the deep scars of a lifetime spent in a world that constantly tried to push him down. But she also saw something else, something new. He was beginning to see what she saw. The truth was undeniable now. Silence had never protected them, it had only kept them invisible. I want to do something about it, Saw continued, determination rising in her chest. I want to speak out to make them listen. I don't care if it's hard, if it's painful. We can't keep carrying this weight alone, pretending it's not there. I won't be silent anymore. James looked at her, his expression softening even further. I'm proud of you, Saw, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But know this, the world will push back. They will make you feel small. They will try to silence you. But you can't let them. You have to keep speaking, keep fighting. Saw nodded, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. But as she stood there, with her father's support behind her, she knew she had already crossed a line. She wasn't going back. This was the beginning of a new fight, a fight not just for her own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The cost of silence was too great, and she was ready to pay the price of speaking her truth. The next few days after that conversation with her father felt like a moment of both clarity and chaos. Saw had made a decision, one that was not to be taken lightly, but it was a decision she could no longer avoid. The weight of silence had grown unbearable. She could no longer pretend to be a passive observer in a world that was telling her, with every glance, every action, that she did not belong. She had to act. She had to speak. The air felt different now. The tension that had once lingered beneath the surface, something she had learned to ignore, now seemed to consume everything. Every step she took outside the house felt as though she was walking through a minefield, each interaction a potential explosion, a reminder that she was not in control, that her very presence was, to some, an affront. The deeper Saw delved into her thoughts, the more she realized just how deeply ingrained the system of racial oppression was in this country. It wasn't just a matter of outward discrimination. No, it was far more insidious. It was a part of the everyday fabric of life. From the way people moved around her in public spaces to the subtle exclusion from conversations, the constant reinforcement of who deserved space, who deserved power, and who did not. Saw had always been aware of these dynamics, but the events on the flight, the way she had been dismissed, judged, and made to feel small, had broken through the veneer of normalcy. These quiet moments of racism were not just unfortunate accidents. They were the result of a long history of systems designed to keep people like her in their place. Systems that worked to ensure that Black bodies, despite all they might accomplish or achieve, were always relegated to the margins. Always told that they didn't belong in spaces that demanded respect, that held power, that had been reserved for someone else. She thought back to the way Kayla, the flight attendant, had looked at her, the subtle way she had judged her not for the seat she had paid for, but for her very being. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the eyes that looked down on her, the assumption that someone like her was not meant to be in first class, no matter the ticket in her hand. It was the way she had been dismissed, her humanity reduced to something that could be easily brushed aside. Saw wasn't the first to feel this way. She wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. Every act of discrimination, every slight, every whisper in her ear was another piece of evidence that the world was not designed for her. The struggle, as her father had told her, wasn't just about a moment, it was about a lifetime of these small, quiet injustices. But what did that mean for her now? What did it mean to stand up, to fight back, when the enemy wasn't just one person but an entire system that had been in place for centuries? How do you fight something that refuses to show itself, something that exists in every conversation, every glance, every policy that reinforced the idea that her existence was a mistake? Her father's voice echoed in her mind. The world will push back. They will make you feel small. Saw wasn't naive. She knew the world would resist. She knew there would be people who would tell her to go back to her place, who would remind her of how things had always been. The same people who benefited from a system built on her exclusion, on the exclusion of so many others, would fight to preserve that system at all costs. But she also knew something else. She couldn't live in the shadow of that fear anymore. She had to stand up for herself, for her dignity, for the right to occupy space in this world just like anyone else. She couldn't afford to be silent any longer. One evening, Saw found herself sitting in front of her laptop, staring at a blank screen. She had already written and rewritten the words in her mind 100 times, but now, as the cursor blinked in front of her, she was frozen. How could she begin to confront the world in a way that would be heard? She had spent her life trying to fit in, trying to make others comfortable with her presence. But now, she realized, that was the problem. She had been trying to fit into a space that wasn't built for her, a space that had no room for people like her to truly thrive. So, what would happen if she stopped trying to fit in? What would happen if she began to demand a place at the table, to demand respect, to demand equality, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been made to feel less than? She could already hear the whispers, the subtle criticisms, the judgment from those who would see her speaking out as a threat. But if she was going to do this, she had to stop caring about those whispers. Finally, her fingers moved across the keys. To whom it may concern, she began, taking a deep breath before continuing. I am writing to share an experience that I recently had while traveling on your airline. I believe it is important that I speak up, not just for myself, but for the many others who have been subjected to the quiet but insidious nature of systemic discrimination that continues to permeate every corner of our society. The words flowed now, the anger, the frustration, and the exhaustion all pouring out onto the screen. She wrote about the way she had been treated on the flight, the way she had been asked to move from her seat despite having a valid ticket for first class. She wrote about the whispers, the stares, the subtle but powerful ways she had been made to feel that her body, her presence, was something to be tolerated, not welcomed. And she wrote about the larger implications of what this meant, the larger system of racial injustice that had built and reinforced these attitudes for generations. When Sa hit send, it wasn't just the email that left her fingertips. It was a message to the world, a message to herself. I will not be silenced anymore. But even as she closed the laptop, the weight of what she had done began to settle in. The world would push back, she knew it. The forces of racism, of power, of privilege would fight to protect the system that benefited them. And she would face the brunt of it. The next few days were a blur. Sa heard nothing from the airline, nothing except the silence of her own growing fear. What if nothing changed? What if the silence she had spoken against was the very silence that would defeat her? What if the system was so deeply entrenched that no matter how loud her voice grew, it would never be enough? But then, on the 5th day after she had sent the email, she received a response. The airline acknowledged her complaint, and to her surprise, they had escalated the matter to higher management. They promised an investigation and assured her that they took her concerns seriously. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale, though the relief was short-lived. This was just the beginning. The real fight had only just begun. In the quiet moments that followed, Sa realized that this was what it meant to stand up, to expose the contradictions of the system, to call out the invisible forces that worked tirelessly to keep her, and others like her, in their place. And as she looked out the window that night, at the bridge in the distance, she knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. But it was a war worth fighting. And she was ready. Sa had spent years learning how to exist in a world that made her feel as though her very presence was a challenge. From the time she was young, she had learned the subtle art of shrinking herself, of making herself small, quiet, invisible, so that the world would find her easier to tolerate. Her body, her blackness, her very being were not things society had taught her to embrace, but to hide. Now, as she stood in front of her computer screen, reading through her letter to the airline again, she realized how much that silence had cost her. How much it had cost every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. She had expected the response she received, a polite acknowledgement, an empty promise of an investigation. But what else had she expected? That they would suddenly see her for who she was? That the company, the very system that had allowed the injustice to take place, would change overnight? No, this was the quiet battle that her father had fought, that countless others had fought before her. A battle where the weapons were words, where the enemy was not a single person, but an entire system. A system built on a long history of exclusion, of telling people like her that they didn't belong in spaces of power, that they could be pushed aside with a smile, that their bodies, their souls, were always secondary to someone else's comfort. And yet, even now, as she stood at the edge of this fight, the resistance felt louder than ever. It wasn't just the airline. It was the people around her, the world that had constructed this narrative. Who are you to challenge it? They whispered to her. Who are you to demand space, to make people uncomfortable? The world had been built to exclude her. And now, even as she demanded her place, it fought back harder than ever. The days that followed were a blur of emails, phone calls, and waiting. The airline had promised to look into the situation, but she knew better than to take their words at face value. She had seen how these systems worked before. The public relations machine would churn, the apologies would be made, and the world would move on. The real change? That was always a distant dream. But still, Saw couldn't afford to stay silent. Her father had taught her that much. They will push back, he had said. They will make you feel small. And they did. The system had made her feel small her whole life, and it wasn't about to stop now. But what if her silence, her reluctance to speak out, was the thing that had kept her in her place all this time? What if she was complicit in the very system that had oppressed her? She couldn't go back to the person she was before the flight. She couldn't unsee what had happened, couldn't ignore the whispers of injustice that haunted her. The fight wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about a lifetime of being told, you don't belong here. One morning, as she sat at the kitchen table, the phone rang. It was the airline. The voice on the other end was polite, but Saw could hear the thin veneer of professionalism over the discomfort. Miss Rivers, the representative began, we've completed our internal investigation regarding your recent experience with us. We understand that this situation caused you distress, and we deeply regret that. Saw could hear the rehearsed words. She had heard them before in the mouths of people who never meant a word of them. I understand, Saw replied, her voice steady, though the weight of everything still pressed on her chest. But I don't just want an apology. I want change. I want to see the system confronted, the way it operates, the way it treats people like me, like others who have been made to feel like they don't belong. There was silence on the other end. Saw could feel the weight of her words pressing down on the representative. Well, Miss Rivers, the voice said after a moment, we are taking your complaint seriously, and we are working to ensure that our staff receives additional training to prevent incidents like this in the future. Training? Saw repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Training won't change the system. You're not going to fix anything by telling people to be more polite. The system is broken. I need you to understand that it's not just about being nice to Black people, it's about rethinking the way we all move through the world. The silence on the phone was deafening, but it was the kind of silence that Saw had come to expect. The kind of silence that said they didn't really care about the solution, only about pacifying her enough to make her go away. It was the same silence she had heard in the airport, on the plane, in her own life. The unspoken truth of living as a Black woman in America, the knowledge that her pain, her struggle, her existence, was always secondary to the comfort of those who had power. I'll be watching, Saw said, her voice growing colder. And I'll keep speaking up. I won't let you forget this. Not now, not ever. She hung up the phone, her heart pounding. For a brief moment, she felt the familiar rush of powerlessness. But she refused to let it control her. This was bigger than her. She wasn't alone in this fight. This was the fight of every Black person, every marginalized person who had been told they didn't belong. This was the fight of the people who had been silenced, who had been erased from the stories of power and progress. And she couldn't stop now, not when so many before her had given so much. The truth was, Saw wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel small, to feel invisible. She was fighting for the right to exist, to take up space, to claim her dignity in a world that had told her she was not allowed to have it. It was a fight she knew she could never win in one moment, one day. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she stood tall, that she spoke her truth, and that she refused to be silent. The next morning, Saw received another email. This time, it wasn't from the airline. It was from a group of passengers who had been on the flight with her. They had seen what had happened. They had heard the whispers, felt the tension, and they reached out to her. They apologized for their silence, for not standing up when they should have. It was a small thing, this gesture, but it felt like the first real step toward change. It was a reminder that silence wasn't just the enemy of progress, it was the ally of oppression. Saw smiled softly as she stood by the window, looking out at the bridge in the backyard. The world was still the same, she knew. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she felt like she was no longer alone in it. And that, she realized, was where the real battle began. And as the day unfolded, Saw took a deep breath. She was ready for whatever came next. She was ready to fight, not just for herself, but for the world that had yet to see the power of truth.